We're here today with Will Lamb. Will, thank you for coming into the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Jake.
It's good to see you. We're office mates this year, teaching U.S. history together. Just gave our midterm. How do you think it went, Will?
I think it went well. Talking with my students afterward, I think they crushed it. Try to be really transparent with the test before. And I found that I think part of it is like getting them to know the material, but a lot of it is just like being there, being available, making sure that they feel really reassured and confident.
Are you enjoying, I guess this is the first year, right? This is your first year as a Penn Fellow, so first experience teaching. Has it been a good year so far in the U.S. history classroom?
Oh, it's been awesome. I'm blessed with incredible students who've stayed super engaged, and they've been really helpful in understanding that I'm also a first-year teacher, and I'm completely transparent with them that there's going to be a little bit of experimentation in trying to find our groove.
So what's it been like for you with the Penn Fellowship experience that's happening at the same time as you're in the classroom teaching? I know that you have essays and different assignments that you're working on for Penn during the year. How have you found this, I guess, joint teaching experience with Penn classes and then practical experience?
It's awesome, especially getting to connect with other fellows at other schools and seeing the different sort of school cultures. I feel like I get a sort of macro view on independent schools in general. And they also like get us to reflect on the institution that we work at. So with Portrait of a Learner and seeing my student go through his experiences, I've started thinking about like bigger institutional things at Gilman, like the fact that it's all boys, the fact that it's K through 12, and how a lot of those factors sort of inform the kids' experience. It's pretty cool.
Are you writing about those macro issues here at Gilman, or like the boys' school environment? And I know there's a history paper that you write, or the history of the institution paper.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of things are you writing about for those topics?
Yeah, so we just did Portrait of a Learner. So we kind of go with a student, observe their overall experiences, conduct a couple of interviews with them. And I would say we're asked to sort of situate their experiences within the broader context at Gilman. And one of the coolest things that I've begun to realize at Gilman that I didn't really observe prior to the assignment was the fact that a lot of these boys have friendships that are from middle school. Mm-hmm. So they're bringing a lot 9 through 12th, whereas if you go to a 9 through 12 high school, everybody sort of starts off brand new, it feels, and there's a lot of that. So it's a completely different experience. So things like that have given me better insight on being a teacher and kind of tapping into the relationships that I have with my students.
So I know you went to an independent school, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience in high school at an independent school, and then maybe, some of the things that you've noticed from going, from that experience to Gilman, which is all boys in Baltimore. I'm sure there's some similarities, but there are a lot of differences maybe from the experience you had in high school.
Absolutely. Similarities and differences. So I went to a boarding environment in the Northeast, and so that is one of the biggest differences that I've noticed is that a lot of times students and teachers don't really get to interact a lot with parents and families. And I think what is like a unique sort of awesome thing that I've noticed at Gilman is there's more of a community in the localized sense, given that a lot of these families are more local. And so you kind of get to see a sort of interaction with the local community, whereas I went to a more international environment, which was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of opened my eyes to the power of independent schools and being able to sort of leverage their resources in creating like a really fun environment.
So what year did you start at Andover?
Yeah,
ninth grade?
yeah, ninth grade. Yeah, and so ninth through 12th, and I was a local boarder. So I lived in the nearby town, which was a 10-minute drive in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So I kind of got the best of both worlds of being able to connect with family any weekend I kind of wanted to, but still really being in an immersive environment, like sleeping in the dorms, being around all the kids. So it was great.
Do you remember, I guess, when you first got to Andover and you're walking around, like your first impressions of the place and maybe how, you adapted to that a different environment there?
Yeah, it was a really unique transition. I went to a Catholic nonprofit middle school in Lawrence with a graduating class of 11.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So for me, the step up in population was incredible.
Yeah.
So a lot of my classmates were from all over the world. They were from New York, LA, different parts of the US. And so for me, like the biggest thing was sort of a culture shock almost, and being able to interact with a lot of people that weren't from like one city that I'd been used to my entire life. Um, Another big part of it was that there's a large socioeconomic like disparity or difference in a lot of the students that the school um, does, I think, a good job of like recognizing. But me coming from a nonprofit school that was explicitly for students with a certain income threshold, it was something that I definitely like experienced and grappled with throughout high school, especially at 14, 15.
Yeah, I remember the way I got into teaching was a lot of my teammates in my college lacrosse team went to these, Northeast boarding schools and independent schools, and they were always talking about their experience. And I wanted to, I was interested in teaching English and coaching lacrosse, and I did this summer experience at Choate, pretty close in Connecticut, and I was just blown away by just the facilities and the library and the international population just in the summer of students from all over the world who wanted to come to Choate. And I went to a good school. I went to a public school outside of Philadelphia in Berwyn, Pennsylvania called Conestoga, and I had a great high school experience, like great teachers, really good public school. But I was just blown away by, that this is like a experience that high schoolers have, before going to college. It was nicer in a lot of ways than most colleges. So, I feel like that is probably what the first time experience is like when you get to one of these prestigious New England boarding schools. You're like, wow, people actually go to a school like this.
Yeah, I remember visiting campus and I was blown away. I think a lot of these schools have amazing resources for the kids, and it's pretty incredible that high schoolers get to experience that.
Now, in the Penn Fellowship, what has your experience been like with some of the different schools and the different mentors? I remember when I was a Penn Fellow, I loved talking to some of the all-star teachers and mentors from these different schools because I feel like I could pick up so much valuable information from them and their experience and the different ways that they approach the Penn Fellowship. What's that been like for you? And I know, you only have, two times during the year where you actually go to Penn, and the other two meetings are on different independent school campuses.
Yep. It's been a great experience. The other schools, getting to learn from seasoned teachers who've been teaching for over 15 years, it's a lot to absorb, and it's really great. I think the cohort model of being able to connect with other fellows who are in our position has also been super useful in getting to just like bounce ideas off of each other, and what we're doing in our classes has been exceptional. It's also gotten me to reflect a lot on my experiences here at Gilman and how amazing of a mentor Matt Baum has been. Just super experienced, incredibly thoughtful, and he's been like really vital in my success and enjoyment as a first-year teacher.
I remember observing Matt my first couple years teaching because I was trying to get some different perspectives of how to orchestrate the co-ed classroom with Roland Park and Bryn Mawr. And what I love so much about Matt's style of teaching is he's very, there's never really a wrong answer. He's very agreeable in the classroom. So whatever somebody says for a response or for an answer, he's always nodding his head, and you're on the right track, but he'll be able to steer you in a very, you're wrong type of way. I liked his, I guess, general approach in the classroom of creating conversation and facilitating discussion between these different schools, which can be awkward at first, as I'm sure you know.
Absolutely.
But he's just very good at that, very smooth.
And he's super approachable, as you're saying. And that's a big thing I've been trying to do in my classrooms that I've noticed, is that kids feel really comfortable asking him questions after class, visiting him for office hours. So that sort of relational teaching is something I've tried to kind of incorporate into my classes too. It's good when like students feel like they can ask you really about anything. So Matt has been great in kind of seeing him in action.
So, Will, how did you get into history, and what made you want to become a history teacher?
Yeah, Jake, I actually never viewed myself as a history student until junior year in high school. And I think it showed me like the power of teaching and having someone who like really believes in you. But I remember my history teacher, Mr. Racklin, in my U.S. history class, he taught us about growth mindset, and he gave me exceptional feedback on my essay. And every time I met with him one-on-one, he was approachable in a similar way to Matt is. And really, it just took him to see something in me that got me more interested in the topic. So I started exploring it more in college as well. And something that fascinated me within college is sometimes you can pick electives that are more specific to your interests. And I remember thinking about wanting to learn about U.S. immigration, wanting to learn about the Vietnamese American experience. And sort of that led me to history has always been a means for me to understand myself and understand my community, understand the world around me. And it's easy to get into a rabbit hole when you're reading about history and you're like, yeah, that is, I'm seeing that in my day-to-day experience or in the past. So I started getting really into pursuing history to understand myself and understand the world.
Yeah, it's a really cool way of thinking about history. I try to talk to my students about like why we study history and why history is interesting, because I feel like, when you're in high school, when you're younger, I feel like a lot of students think of it as just something they have to check off and get through and memorize things and regurgitate on the test. But now, this year, as I'm teaching history, I've always been into history. I've always found it interesting. Like, I've loved learning about U.S. history for as long as I can remember. But now that I'm teaching it, I'm thinking more about individuals and how history is really a study of people, which makes it just so much more interesting. The nuances and the complexities and the hypocrisy of the individual. You could look at any person in history through that lens, and it just makes for such an interesting study. But yeah, I think this year it's been really important for me to talk to my students, as I'm sure you're doing too, about like why study history. What are we doing here? What's the purpose of me giving you this, 31 multiple choice midterm evaluation?
Absolutely.
But yeah, how did you approach that? I guess that lens of immigration was what drew you to the subject, and what within immigration was so interesting to you?
Yeah. So Lawrence, my hometown, is very much an immigrant city. From its inception, a lot of white Europeans came to Lawrence for a better life. There's a lot of history in Lawrence regarding like unions and labor history. And I think also in the starting around the 1940s, but especially in the 1960s, after the Hart-Celler Act, really Lawrence was a site in which a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean, from Southeast Asia, also came to Lawrence for a better life. And I remember like learning about that in a history classroom in college and kind of seeing how these pieces of legislation that Congress was passing really played a role in the community that I interacted with. And kind of that's something that I always try to think about as I'm designing curriculum is like, how is history personal? And I'm trying to consider all the histories that my students are bringing into the classroom. So on the topic of like when we were just discussing of making history feel important to students, I think that students learn best when they feel like the material has like a direct relationship to their everyday life.
Right.
So for me, exploring that history of immigration has been pretty crucial in developing my interest.
Yeah. What was that class called, and who taught it, and what was the, I guess, structure of the college class you took?
Yeah, it was called U.S. Migration slash Immigration. So my professor put a lot of thought into not only talking about immigration, but also internal migrations within the U.S. So the Great Migration, etc. It was taught by Professor Deppenbush, who was an assistant professor at Colgate. Shout out to Professor Deppenbush. She played a huge part of my interest in history and my life in college. And basically, what I liked about that class was we had direct primary sources that just explained the day-to-day lives of immigrants throughout U.S. history. So, for example, we explored 1930s love letters sent back and forth across the U.S.-Mexico border.
Wow.
And reading journal articles like that, where they could contextualize that into the history, made me realize that history is about personal stories. History is about understanding how these forces are shaping our relationships with each other.
Yeah.
And she brought a ton of articles like that that I'm actually looking to incorporate into the Gilman classroom so that students get the real feel of what the history was like.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach, and something I can continue to try to work on in my class is making history about humans, not about facts. Because history is about facts, but I don't know how many students are going to be excited about learning, hard facts. It's much more easy to attach yourself to the human being, the person going through this experience, the emotions they felt, right? That kind of thing is much more lasting, or gives a much more lasting impression on the learner, I think. So in your class, what are you excited about going forward? What are some of the things that are working so far in your... Do you have two classes, right, or just one this year?
Yeah, two sections.
Two sections.
Of
Okay.
U.S. history, so two sets of juniors. I think what's worked particularly well is I've talked to Matt about relational learning, and given that my classes are coordinated and that students are coming from different schools, that was a big thing that I thought about was how are they going to interact with each other? Our classes are really discussion based for the most part, and so they need to we need to cultivate like a good sense of community. So it can't just be Gilman students all sitting in one place and RPCS or in Bryn Mawr students sitting all together. So getting them with just like day-to-day icebreakers, making sure that all students feel welcome in the class has been useful in getting them to interact with each other. And I think it's been paying off dividends, especially as we're getting into December, January. And I think the students have been really engaged. I think when I've given, or in general, when teachers have given students autonomy as learners and a bigger role in the classroom and kind of try to minimize their own role, students really appreciate that. And so I think those are some big takeaways in my first semester of teaching. But in terms of topics, I'm super excited for the latter part of the year too. Given just my own interests, like I've thought about how I'm going to teach the New Deal, how I'm going to teach the Cold War. So on like the topics, I'm super psyched.
Yeah, that's good because I haven't thought much about that. I'm like a week by a week taking it as I can, you know. I find history so exciting to teach. It's fun. It's challenging though. Like I would say maybe it's just because it's my first year teaching history, but I would say it's a little bit more challenging for me than English is because there's a little bit more pick and choose how you want to focus the class and what you want to focus on and what you might be leaving out if you focus on one thing. It's a complex subject, especially 1 year teaching all of U.S. history.
Yeah, I think about that every day as I'm lesson planning. And I looked over all of our respective midterms to see what content we're covering. And I think it's cool that we have different emphases and interests that manifest in the classroom. And that's like something that I think about all the time, though, is that if I'm dedicating this 80-minute class period to one particular part of the subject, then there's an opportunity cost that I'm not covering something else.
Right.
So it's difficult, but I found that it's allowed me to be a little bit creative,
Yeah.
which is cool.
So in your class, what do you think your students have gravitated towards this semester? Like, what's been their favorite person or subject to study in your estimation?
That's a really good question. I think there was good interest in talking about the market revolution so far. We spent a good amount of class time on it, and pretty much one of the coolest things about the market revolution is it's this time period in American history with radical economic and social transformations. So I think students like that they see how gender roles are changing through the market revolution, or just like how the country, the actual physical landscape of the country is changing. And of course, it's like really important in setting up the Civil War. And so I think that's a topic that students kind of enjoy, is that it's something that gives them various different lenses to look at the history.
So let me ask you my essay question that I had my students just complete. Andrew Jackson has a very debatable existence on the $20 bill because of his presidential tenure was so positive in some ways and really negative in other ways. So we're thinking about taking Jackson off the $20 bill. Of everybody, maybe everybody in American history, who would you recommend to replace Jackson on the 20?
That's a great question. I know there's been conversation about Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, which I think is would be a really interesting, good idea. I think it's actually in the works. I would love a 20th century figure on the $20 bill, like a more contemporary person, because I think we often associate our printed currency with like the founding fathers, which is, I think, great and important, but I also think that it would be kind of a change to have a more recent figure that is kind of in our cultural imagination or understanding.
Anyone come to mind for you?
That's a good question. I was thinking, I guess you could say MLK is
Oh, that'd be a good
one figure that immediately kind of comes to my mind, but it's definitely a question I'll have to keep considering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the majority of my class chose Frederick Douglass, and I think that's a good answer because we spent a lot of time talking about Frederick Douglass, reading a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, um, and I think he would make a great replacement because he was so influential on American history. But MLK is a good one too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Will, what are your plans for break? What are you getting up to?
So I'm going to be in the Boston area. I'm going to be back in Lawrence, seeing family, and I have a 12-year-old sister, and so I'm just going to make sure to
Do you
create
really?
some
What's the gap between you guys?
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
So I've got a 13, almost 14-year-old sister. We've got 15-year gap between us.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a cool experience. It's
Yeah.
a cool experience, that gap. And so I'm just trying to make sure that she has an amazing Christmas break. So I'm thinking what she wants to do, what restaurants she might want to go to. But really, those 2 weeks, I'm just going to be spending time with family and catching up with friends. There are some friends since high school that I haven't talked to, but they're in the Boston area, so got to catch up.
What grade is your sister in?
She's in seventh.
Seventh grade?
Yeah, seventh grade.
Awesome. That's fun. Yeah, I remember when Jenny was a little bit younger. It was fun coming home from college, and Santa Claus was still in the work, so we had to set up the house. We had Elf on the Shelf. Now she's kind of a little teenager, but still really fun to go see your little siblings.
For sure. And she actually goes to the same middle school that I went to. So we've had the same teachers. We've had very similar but very different experiences. So helping her and kind of guiding her through my own or talking about my own experiences has been awesome. It's gotten me to reflect, but also trying to just help her in any way that I can navigate, like be middle school and eventually high school.
What has it been like for you, I guess, relocating from Boston area and then Colgate to Baltimore? Like new experience, new city. Do you like it? What do you think about Baltimore?
Yeah, Baltimore's been great. That was a big thing when interviewing for Gilman. I realized I've really never left the Northeast.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed the parts of Baltimore and just Baltimore overall when I was here on my sort of tour. And Baltimore's been great. I think it honestly reminds me a lot of the Northeast. And I also like that Baltimore's smaller.
Yeah.
So if I was teaching in New York for me is like every time I go, I'm like very overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Baltimore, it's been cool because it's a smaller city, so you're able to sort of navigate around, explore different neighborhoods, and it's been cool.
Yeah. I like how easy it is to get downtown and then, come back up to Gilman, which you're still in Baltimore, but it's a little bit outside of downtown.
Yeah,
It's
and
quick.
it's like a 15, 20-minute drive.
Yeah.
So it's awesome.
Cool. All right, so let's get to maybe the book recs that you have for us, or one book rec, or however many you brought in.
I brought two.
Brought two.
Yeah, I couldn't help myself. So one is a bit more, so they're both actually history related.
Okay.
One is called Silencing the Past by Michel-Rolph Trouillot, The Power and the Production of History. And basically it introduces this idea of historical silence in history production. So the fact that there's omission in facts, and then there's also historical silences in how we interpret those facts and who's choosing those facts. So I think that for me was a great book because it helped me understand history as a discipline overall. And it challenges me as a teacher to understand where historical silences might be in my curriculum. And I'm very open with this with my students, and I've tried to kind of mention to them or ask them to consider how the classroom is a place where historical silences are sort of amplified or produced. So I tell them based on my own interests as a teacher, that dictates the content. And so I'm just trying to get them to be critical of primary sources, being able to understand whose voices are being heard and what is not being said.
Right. So for people who aren't as familiar with that term, like what do you mean by historical silences, and maybe what's an example of one or two?
So a historical silence is a lack of like a gap in knowledge or the historiography that is either intentional or unintentional. So lack of documentation, for example. An example could be, for example, I think a lot of history classrooms struggle with historical silences as it pertains to indigenous groups because of documentation, lack thereof, whether intentional or unintentional. So that's kind of one example.
Yeah. I think that Titus Kaphar TED Talk is so good at like talking about or showing an example, like in the visual realm of what a historical silence looks like, because you've seen it, you showed your students, but he spray paints pretty much half of a painting that he did himself of a replica, and highlights different aspects of the painting that have been brushed aside or not as documented as maybe other aspects of history that we typically look at and study. So I think that registers with students, and I think that's a great, I guess, term to talk about in the history classroom, because there are so many parts of history that you could miss, or you don't go deep enough into for different reasons, but lack of documentation, lack of focus, or just intentionally skipping over parts that we don't want to talk about in history.
Yeah, and that was a great video, Jake, and I'm glad you sent it to me. My kids or my students like really appreciated it, and it definitely facilitated a great conversation. So I'm grateful for that. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, it's good. And then the other book, what else?
Yeah, the other book is called The Great Cat Massacre and Other Episodes in French Cultural History by Robert Darnton. So why I picked this book is kind of what we were talking about. Unfortunately, a lot of students learn about history as a memorization of facts, but this is purely storytelling with robust ways of finding sources through folktale or through oral histories. And in particular, the chapter or the story of the Great Cat Massacre, it was sort of set in Paris in the late 1730s in a sort of proto-industrial age in which the Industrial Revolution hasn't taken hold yet, but you're starting to sort of see French society change. And these apprentice printers that resented their working conditions and their treatment basically take it out on the owner's cat, who is sort of a symbol for privilege or their perceived better treatment by their employer. And so it's a really cool book in that you learn a lot about what it was like at the time in Paris in 1730, but through a story, which that's why I recommend the book. Is I think it shows that history is really storytelling. It's what we do with those stories, and I think there's a lot of great stories. That's just one chapter in the book.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, because as much as, the textbook for a history class is necessary, I think this Jill Lepore, These Truths book has been helpful in my class, because she's so good at weaving all the facts and all the information that you need to know about American history into something that's readable as a narrative, and it's a little bit more exciting and interesting to read than the textbook, I think.
Yeah, her prose is beautiful, and it's cool to read history in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm definitely going to pull from Jill Lepore's These Truths. It's a great book.
Any movies that you're looking forward to watching over break? I know this Killers of a Flower Moon I want to go see in theaters. The Rotunda Theater that I saw in Napoleon, it's $7 on Tuesday, so that
Yeah,
could be an option today, maybe.
that sounds awesome.
Yeah,
Honestly, like, I really want to watch some of the classics.
yeah.
Um, I'm the type of person who, like, hasn't seen a lot of the great ones, like Shawshank Redemption.
You haven't seen Shawshank Redemption?
No.
Oh, there you go.
So I'm probably gonna watch some of the big names that have been always been out there that your parents might talk about, but I haven't seen. Shawshank Redemption just is one that comes to mind.
That's awesome. What do you like to do when you go home and you're in your hometown again? Like, what are some of the things that you'll do when you get back?
Yeah, I actually have maintained a pretty good or close relationship with my middle school. So I've taught there over the past couple summers, and they're having a Christmas show. So I'm probably gonna check that out, see old teachers, see my sister perform a play. But really in Massachusetts or when I have free time, I just kind of relax with family. We'll go out to eat. Um, I like to exercise with my sister, so she's been getting really into basketball.
Nice.
So we'll shoot some hoops for
There you
sure.
go.
Yeah.
Do you go into Boston much?
Yeah, especially coming out of high school. I actually didn't go to Boston too much. Like growing up just 45 minutes away,
Yeah.
I probably went under like 8 to 10 times.
Yeah, you gotta get ready for the traffic
Yeah.
getting in.
Traffic is gnarly. So I'll probably take the train.
There you go.
Yeah.
Is there a T stop in Lawrence? Is that too far?
Yeah, there's a commuter rail. So easy, quick hour. I'm definitely going to explore Boston because I've only explored a couple neighborhoods like Cambridge, Allston, but there's a lot more out there that I want to check out.
Great town for history, for a history teacher too. You know, you could go on the what's the trail called? Freedom Trail, Faneuil Hall, North End. I mean, there's just so much history in that city that you could check out.
Absolutely. I'll report back.
Yeah.
Maybe incorporate some of that into the curriculum.
All right, Will, maybe one more question. From the people that you've met and you've gotten to know so far at Gilman, if you could recommend somebody for the podcast that you would like to hear more from and learn more about their background and what they're interested in, who would you recommend?
That's a great question. I was going to say Mr. US, but you already had him because I think he's been incredible on this journey with me, super insightful. And I always love to hear his stories. I think somebody from the history department deserves a shout out, and I would love the Gilman community would benefit from hearing more about them. Miss Finnerty,
Yeah.
Miss Hampton, I
Yep.
think they would be great guests.
Yes, I need to get them. We need to get them on. We've had Matt Baum on, Brooks Matthews, Mr. Slutkin has been on. Who else is in the history department?
And I've seen all of those episodes too
Oh, you have?
on 2 times speed. Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Thanks for watching, and thanks for coming in today, Will. It's been a fun time, and wishing you a great winter break.
Thanks, you too, Jake. It's been fun.